The farmhouse in Mercer County, Ohio, sat on a rise above 112 acres of the St. Mary's River bottomland, and in the spring of 1991, it held a woman named Dorothy Hausman, who was 63 years old and who had been farming that ground, in one form or another, for 40 years. She had arrived at the farm as a young wife in 1951, when her husband Gerald had brought her from a Dark County family to the Mercer County ground that his father had homesteaded in the 1920s and that Gerald had inherited in 1948 when his father died of a stroke at the kitchen table during the February that followed the hard winter of 1947. Gerald had been 26 and Dorothy had been 23, and the farm had been 106 acres of river bottom cropland and 6 acres of hillside pasture that the senior houseman had assembled across 20 years of careful debt-free accumulation that the family had not fully known the history of until the afternoon the attorney read the will. Dorothy had learned to farm from Gerald in the specific way that farm wives of the early 1950s learned the work, not as a formal transmission, not as a deliberate education with lessons and progressions, but as the daily participation of a woman who was present for everything and who paid close attention because the work required her attention, and because her own nature was the kind that paid close attention to whatever it was placed in front of. She had driven the tractor for the first time in the spring of 1952 when Gerald had needed a second set of hands on a cultivating operation that was too large and too time-sensitive for one person to complete in the available weather window. She had not needed to be told twice about anything mechanical. Gerald had noted this early, and had noted it with the specific satisfaction of a man who has discovered that his partner's capabilities exceed what either of them had assumed at the outset. By 1960, Dorothy was managing the planting schedule and the rotation decisions alongside Gerald, not as a secondary voice, but as an equal contributor to the kitchen table conversations that produced each season's plan. By 1965, the farm account was in her handwriting. Gerald's hand had developed a tremor from a nerve injury sustained in a barn repair accident in 1964, and the handwriting had become difficult for him to read after a full day's outdoor work, and Dorothy had taken over the account records the way she took over everything that needed to be taken over, without announcement, without ceremony, without the specific drama that the assumption of new responsibility sometimes produces in households that are paying attention to the balance of roles. The farm account was in her handwriting from 1965 forward, and it remained in her handwriting for the rest of the farm's documented history. Gerald had died in March of 1989. He had been 67 years old, and the death had been the specific kind of farm death that farming families recognize, and that the farming community acknowledges with the particular grief of people who understand that a man who has worked physical ground for 40 years, and who dies in the late winter before the season, he will not see as dying at the moment that is most consistent with the life he lived. Gerald had been in the tractor shed doing the pre-season service on the Farmall 560 diesel when the coronary took him, quickly, without prolonged suffering, which was the way Gerald would have chosen if choosing had been available. He was found by Dorothy at 11 in the morning when she brought the mid-morning coffee to the shed. The service log was open on the workbench. The 560 was half-serviced, the oil drain pan still under the block. She had set the coffee down on the shelf beside the log and had called the Mercer County Sheriff from the farmhouse telephone and had sat beside Gerald on the shed floor until the ambulance arrived. She had been 61 years old. She had been a farmer for 40 years. The estate had taken 18 months to settle, which was not unusual for a farm estate in Mercer County in the late 1980s, when the aftermath of the farm crisis had left the legal and financial landscape of agricultural property in a more complex condition than the pre-crisis years had produced. Gerald's will had been straightforward: the farm to Dorothy, everything to Dorothy. The simple document of a man who had not imagined any distribution other than the one that 40 years of partnership had made obvious. But the farm's title history had not been simple, and the title search that the estate's settlement required had produced a situation that the attorney handling the estate had described to Dorothy in May of 1989, 2 months after Gerald's death, with the specific care of a man delivering complicated news to a recently widowed woman who was still managing the farm's spring planting from a position of grief. The title complication was this: the senior houseman's 1920s assembly of the 112 acres had not been fully completed in the way that the family had believed it to be. One of the parcels, a 38-acre section on the south end of the river bottom ground. The best drained acres on the property, the ones that the farm's corn rotation depended on most heavily, had been acquired by the senior houseman in 1931 through a private land contract with a Mercer County family named Kellner, whose patriarch had been in financial difficulty during the Depression's early years. The land contract had been recorded at the courthouse, but the final deed transfer, the instrument that converted the contract's completion into clear title, had never been filed. The senior houseman had paid the contract in full by 1936, by all the evidence the family could reconstruct, but the filing of the completion deed had not happened, and the Kellner family's subsequent history had made the omission invisible until the title search for the estate had found the gap. The gap meant that the 38 acres had a title cloud, not a definitive adverse claim, but a deficiency in the chain of title that made a clear transfer from the estate to Dorothy legally uncertain. The attorney had said he would need to locate the Kellner heirs, reconstruct the land contract's payment history, and file the appropriate quiet title action to clear the deficiency before the estate transfer could be completed cleanly. He had estimated the process would take 12 to 18 months. Dorothy had said, "And the farm?" The attorney had said, "You continue to farm it." The title cloud does not prevent use. It prevents transfer. Dorothy had said, "I will need to farm it." She had farmed it. The 1989 season had been planted on schedule, in the weather windows that the St. Mary's River bottom's drainage character created, with the Farmall 560 diesel that Gerald had been servicing when he died, and that Dorothy had finished servicing in the week after the funeral. She had completed the service from the open log that had been on the workbench, found the entry Gerald had started, identified what had been done and what remained, done the remaining items from the service schedule that the log's format described. The service had been completed on the Saturday of the week after the funeral. The log entry had been completed in Dorothy's handwriting following Gerald's, the date of the completed service recorded alongside the date Gerald had begun it. It was the first service log entry in Dorothy's handwriting. It would not be the last. The estate settlement had proceeded through the legal process the attorney had described. The Kellner heir search had located 2 surviving grandchildren of the original Kellner patriarch, a man in Columbus and a woman in Cincinnati, neither of whom had any knowledge of the Mercer County land contract from 1931, or any interest in the land beyond the resolution of whatever claim their grandfather's estate might technically have preserved. The quiet title action had been filed in November of 1989. The legal process had moved at the pace that Ohio quiet title actions moved in the early 1990s, which was not a rapid pace but was not an obstructed one. During this 18-month period, the farm's operation had continued without interruption. Dorothy had planted and cultivated and harvested the 1989 and 1990 crops on the full 112 acres, including the 38 acres under title cloud, because the farming of the land was not legally affected by the title cloud, and because the alternative, leaving the 38 acres idle while the legal process resolved, was not an option that her 40 years of farming the ground could accept. The ground needed to be farmed. She farmed it. The 560 had worked every season without field failure. Dorothy had maintained it on the service schedule that Gerald had established in 1971 when the machine arrived at the Schroeder farm from a Paulding County dispersal, and that she had been observing and participating in for 18 years before she became the sole maintainer. The service log showed no gaps in the 18 months between Gerald's death and the estate's final resolution. The entries continued in Dorothy's handwriting with the same interval discipline and the same format that the log had maintained since 1971. The community had been watching. This was not surveillance. It was the attentive observation that small agricultural communities apply to their members, particularly to a recently widowed woman in her early 60s who was farming 112 acres alone and who was navigating a title complication that the community had heard about through the informal network that such matters traveled. The Mercer County farming community's observation of Dorothy Hausman in 1989 and 1990 had the specific character of assessment, not hostile, not intrusive, but calibrating, trying to determine what the situation would require and what the community's appropriate response to that requirement was. What the community observed was a woman who was farming correctly. The planting was on schedule. The field condition was maintained. The 560 was working. The farm account was being kept. Dorothy had continued the account in the format Gerald had established in 1958, and that she had been maintaining in her own handwriting since 1965. The columns unchanged, the accumulation discipline unchanged, the operating reserve held at the minimum that the plan defined as untouchable. The community had expected less, not from any particular assessment of Dorothy's capabilities, but from the general assumption that a 61-year-old woman who had just lost her husband and was facing a title complication while managing 112 acres alone would find the situation overwhelming and would make accommodations. Perhaps lease some of the acres, perhaps hire management help, perhaps reduce the operation's scope to what one person could manage with less than the complete farm's demand. Dorothy had made none of these accommodations. She had managed the complete farm. She had made it look like the accommodations were unnecessary, which was a different thing from the accommodations being unnecessary. The accommodations might have been reasonable, and Dorothy simply did not make them. Her neighbor to the north, a woman named Irma Steinbrenner, who had been farming alongside the Houseman operation since the mid-1970s, when her own husband's health had required her to take over primary management of the Steinbrenner acres, had been the most direct observer of Dorothy's management of the 1989 and 1990 seasons. Irma had offered help, specifically and concretely, equipment, labor, the practical assistance that neighboring farm women offer each other in the particular way of people who understand the physical and logistical demands of the work. Dorothy had accepted help on specific occasions where the work genuinely required a second person. She had not accepted management, not even from Irma, who had offered it with the specific sensitivity of someone who understood the difference between help and the implication that help was necessary. In October of 1990, Irma had stopped at the Houseman farm after the soybean harvest was complete and had found Dorothy entering the final yield numbers in the farm account. The yield was within 3% of the 5-year average. The 38 tidal cloud acres had produced at their normal rate. The 560 had not failed in the field in either of the 2 seasons Dorothy had managed alone. Irma had said, "You have not missed a season." Dorothy had said, "The ground did not stop needing farming." Irma had said, "People expected you to make adjustments." Dorothy had said, "Adjustments to what? The farm is what it is. The seasons are what they are." Gerald managed it one way. "I am managing it the same way because the same way is the correct way for this ground." Irma had said, "The title situation, the legal uncertainty." Dorothy had said, "The title situation is a legal matter the attorney is resolving. It does not change what needs to happen in the fields. I cannot farm legal proceedings. I can farm ground." This exchange had traveled through the community's network in the way that such exchanges travel, imperfectly, partially, with the specific distortion that community transmission applies to direct statements, but with the essential character intact. What the community had heard was a version of, the widow Houseman said the title situation was for the attorney, and the farming was for her. The community had found this response consistent with what it had observed across the 1989 and 1990 seasons. The consistency had been the thing. The quiet title action had been resolved in November of 1990. The Kellner grandchildren had cooperated without difficulty. They had signed the necessary documents. The quiet title judgment had been entered, and the 38 acres had been cleared. The estate transfer had completed in January of 1991, 17 months after Gerald's death, with Dorothy taking clear title to the full 112 acres of Mercer County river bottom ground. She had been 63 years old. She had been farming for 40 years. She owned 112 acres of St. Mary's river bottom ground, free and clear, and one 1971 Farmall 560 diesel that the service log showed had not had a field failure in 20 years of Houseman operation. The title that no one had known existed was the instrument that cleared the cloud, but the finding of it had been the result of a process that Dorothy had driven, not passively received. The attorney had located the Kellner grandchildren in Columbus and Cincinnati through the standard air search that quiet title actions required. But the land contract's payment history, the evidence that the senior Houseman had paid the contract in full by 1936, had been found not in the courthouse records and not in any legal archive, but in a wooden box that Dorothy had found on the top shelf of the farm office closet in June of 1989, 3 months after Gerald's death, while she was reorganizing the office files in the systematic way that she reorganized everything that came under her management. The box had been the senior houseman's, the original houseman, Gerald's father, the man who had assembled the farm across the 1920s and 1930s, and who had died at the kitchen table in 1947. It contained, among other personal and farm documents, a ledger book in the senior houseman's handwriting that recorded, in the 2-column format of a man who kept precise accounts, every payment made on the 1931 Kellner land contract from the contract's execution through the final payment in March of 1936. The ledger recorded the payment date, the amount, and a notation beside each entry that confirmed the form of payment. Cash in every instance, the specific notations of a man who paid in cash and who kept the record of it in the specific detail that cash payments require when there is no institutional record to verify them. The final entry in the ledger's land contract section was dated March 14, 1936, and it read, "Final payment, Kellner land contract, $340, paid in full." The notation beside it, in the senior houseman's careful hand, "Contract completed, deed to be filed, Mercer County Recorder." The deed had not been filed. The contract had been completed. The intention to file had been recorded. The filing itself had not happened, for reasons that 53 years of subsequent history had not preserved. But the ledger's payment record was the evidence that the attorney needed, the documentary proof that the land contract had been satisfied in full before the senior houseman's death, that the title deficiency was a failure of filing rather than a failure of payment, and that the quiet title action's legal basis was the strongest available. Dorothy had brought the wooden box to the attorney's office in July of 1989. She had placed the ledger on his desk and had opened it to the land contract section and had let him read it. He had read it twice. He had said, "This is exactly what we needed. This makes the quiet title straightforward." She had said, "I found it in the closet, in a box of his things." He had said, "Did you know it was there?" She had said, "I did not know what was in the box. I was reorganizing the office and found the box. I went through it the way I go through everything, completely in order, until I understood what was there." He had said, "You saved the case." She had said, "I cleaned the office. The case saved itself once the evidence was found." This exchange had become, in its retold version in the Mercer County community, the sentence that people remembered about the Dorothy Houseman title situation. She cleaned the office, and the evidence was there. The retold version simplified what had actually happened. Dorothy had not been looking for evidence, had not known there was evidence to find, had been reorganizing the office in the specific systematic way she did everything, and had encountered the box in the course of doing the work that needed to be done. But the simplified version captured something true about the character of the woman who had found it. She did the work completely, and the complete work produced the result that the partial work would not have produced. The wooden box had been in the closet since the senior houseman's death in 1947. Gerald had known the box existed. He had mentioned it to Dorothy once, in the early years of their marriage, as one of his father's things that he had preserved without going through in the detail the preservation had warranted. He had intended to go through it. He had not gone through it. 42 years of farming and seasons and the specific busyness of a working farm had not created the occasion for the going through that the intention had identified. Dorothy had created the occasion, not by intention, by the systematic reorganization of a newly single woman who was taking complete inventory of the operation she was now managing alone. The complete inventory had included the wooden box. The wooden box had included the ledger. The ledger had included the March 14, 1936 entry. The entry had been the foundation of the quiet title action. The quiet title action had cleared the 38 acres. The cleared acres were the core of the farm's corn rotation. The corn rotation was what the farm account depended on. The farm account was in her handwriting. The handwriting was 40 years of farming expressed in 2 columns. The 2 columns were the farm. The farm continued. After the estate cleared in January of 1991, Dorothy had made one significant management decision that she had been considering since the previous spring. The farm account showed a land fund column that she had started in 1987, when Gerald was still alive, and they had identified a parcel to the west of the home ground, 24 acres of upland ground that the Brenner family had been farming with declining investment since the patriarch's retirement, and that the Houseman operations rotation planning identified as a useful addition to the home ground's drainage and soil diversity. Gerald had not lived to see the column build to the acquisition threshold. Dorothy had continued building it through 1989 and 1990. In the spring of 1991, the column was at the acquisition threshold. The Brenner patriarch had died the previous November, and his heirs, 2 adult children, 1 in Salina, 1 in Fort Recovery, had been managing the sale process since the new year. Dorothy had called the Salina heir in February of 1991 and had introduced herself and had said she was interested in the 24 acres and that she would prefer a direct transaction to an auction if the family was open to that. The Salina heir had said they were open to it. The transaction had closed in April of 1991. 24 acres of Mercer County upland ground, purchased by Dorothy Houseman at 63 years old, from the land fund column that she and Gerald had started together in 1987, and that she had continued alone through the 2 years of estate settlement and title complication and solo management. Cash, no note. The deed was recorded at the Mercer County Recorder's Office on April 18, 1991. Dorothy had watched the recorder stamp the document and had thought of the senior Houseman's March 1936 ledger entry, contract completed, deed to be filed, and the 53 years between that notation and this recording, and the wooden box in the closet that had bridged the gap. She had driven back to the farm with the recorded deed in her coat pocket and had gone directly to the equipment shed and had started the 560. She had done the spring cultivating on the home ground's 38 acres, the Kellner acres, the acres that the 1936 ledger had finally freed, with the specific attention of a woman who is working ground that has been worked for 40 years, and that is now, for the first time in 40 years, entirely and indisputably her own. The 560 had pulled the cultivating equipment through the river bottom soil in the April condition that the ground produced when the winter had broken correctly, and the drainage was working as the tile system Gerald had maintained required, even across the 38 acres, south to north. The engine ran at the specification the most recent service had confirmed. The hydraulics were responsive. The machine that Gerald had been servicing when he died in March of 1989 was working the ground in April of 1991, 2 years and 1 month later, in the care of a woman who had completed the service from his open log and had not missed a service interval since. Irma Steinbrenner had been watching from the field road when Dorothy came through the south end of the river bottom on the 560. She had stopped her pickup and had watched the cultivating pass from the road shoulder, the specific observation of a neighbor who understands what she is seeing. She had seen a woman in her 60s on a 20-year-old tractor working ground that had just come free of a tidal cloud that had existed since 1936. She had seen the cultivating done correctly, the equipment at the right depth, the passes straight across the contour of the river bottom's slight east slope. She had waited at the field road until Dorothy completed the south pass and turned at the field edge for the return north. Dorothy had seen her there and had brought the 560 to the road shoulder and had killed the engine and climbed down. Irma had said, "You found the deed." Dorothy had said, "I found the ledger." The ledger was the deed. The attorney filed the quiet title. Irma had said, "And the Brenner ground?" Dorothy had said, "Closed in April, 24 acres. No note." Irma had looked at her for a moment. She had said, "Gerald would have been glad." Dorothy had said, "Gerald started the land fund column in 1987. I kept the column. The column closed the Brenner transaction." Irma had said, "You kept everything." Dorothy had said, "The farm needed keeping. I kept it." She had climbed back on the 560 and had started the engine and had continued the cultivating. Irma had watched for another minute and then had driven back north toward her own ground. She had told her son that evening about the field road conversation. Her son had asked what was memorable about it. Irma had said, a woman who farmed 40 years, lost her husband, found a title in a box nobody had opened since 1947, bought 24 more acres at 63 years old, and described all of it in 3 sentences. That is what was memorable about it. The 560 had been retired in 1997, when Dorothy was 69 and the machine was 26 years old, and the cost calculation that the service log's running hour record supported had reached the threshold that she had been watching for 2 seasons. The retirement entry was in her handwriting. Retired October 1997. 26 years of houseman service, no field failures. The machine sold to a Shelby County collector for $950. The log went with it. Her daughter Carol had been taking on more of the field operation since 1994 and had been formally in primary management since 1997 when the 560 retired and the replacement machine, a 1978 Case IH 1086 from a Dark County dispersal, cash from the equipment fund, assessed before purchase, arrived at the farm. Carol maintained the service log in the same format and the same interval discipline that the log had been maintained in since 1971. The entries in Carol's handwriting began in October 1997, following Dorothy's, following Gerald's, the 3 hands distinguishable but the format constant across 26 years of the machine's service and across the replacement service in the years that followed. Dorothy had made one more land acquisition in the spring of 2001, when she was 73, a 17-acre parcel on the north edge of the home ground, the Meister family's corner piece that had been informally available since the early 1990s, and that Dorothy had had in the farm account's land fund column since 1993. The acquisition had brought the Houseman farm to 153 acres. The original 112, plus the 24 Brenner acres from 1991, plus the 17 Meister acres from 2001. All paid for, no note against any of it. She had made the entry in the farm account's deed column herself, in the handwriting that had been in the account since 1965, 153 acres, all clear, no debt. Below that entry, in the same handwriting, she had made a cross-reference note. See wooden box, top shelf, office closet, senior houseman ledger, March 1936 entry, deed to be filed 1991. The cross-reference connected the farm account's 2001 entry to the 1936 ledger that had been in the box for 53 years before she found it. The connection said, the farm's completion began with a ledger entry that was never followed up, found by a woman reorganizing a closet 53 years later. And what the ledger started was completed in the land fund columns that her handwriting had been building since the year the attorney said the title was clouded. Her son-in-law had read the cross-reference entry when he was going through the farm account with Carol in 2005. He had asked Carol what the wooden box reference meant. Carol had explained the complete sequence: the 1931 land contract, the 1936 ledger, the 1989 discovery, the quiet title action, the cleared 38 acres, the Brenner acquisition in the same spring. He had said, she wrote a cross-reference note connecting a 2001 land purchase to a box she found in 1989 that contained a ledger from 1936. Carol had said, she connects everything. The farm account is a document of connections. The columns are connected to each other and to the decisions that produce the numbers in them, and to the ground that the numbers describe. She has been doing this since 1965. The cross-references are how the account teaches you what the numbers mean. He had said, the account taught you how to farm. Carol had said, the account and the ground first, then the account to understand what the ground was telling you. Dorothy had died in 2009, at 81, in the specific way that farming people who have worked their whole lives and remained on their land tend to die. In the farmhouse, in the room that looked out over the river bottom ground, with the farm account and the service logs in the filing cabinet in the office and the wooden box on the top shelf of the office closet where she had found it in June of 1989, and where she had returned it after the attorney had used it, and where it had remained. The wooden box was still there. It held the senior houseman's ledger with the March 14, 1936 entry still legible, the handwriting of a man who had paid a land contract in full and had noted his intention to file the deed and had not lived to see the note fulfilled, and who had been answered 53 years later by a woman who reorganized a closet completely and found the evidence that the reorganization required. The farm was 153 acres. Carol was managing it. The service log continued. The title was clear. All of it. That was what 40 years of farming had built, and what one afternoon of reorganizing a closet had found, and what a woman alone with one old Farmall had continued through the seasons that the ground required. The ground had kept requiring it. She had kept providing it. The account said so. The account was in her handwriting. The handwriting was the farm. The farm continued. That was sufficient. That was everything. The specific nature of Dorothy's management of the 560 across the 2 seasons she farmed alone before the estate cleared deserves an accounting that the summary treatment cannot fully provide, because the precision of the maintenance she continued was not incidental to the story. It was the story's structural spine. The title complication affected the legal disposition of the land. The maintenance discipline affected the physical disposition of the farm's capacity to produce. The 2 threads were parallel and both were essential, and Dorothy's handling of both simultaneously was the specific demonstration of the character the community was assessing across the 1989 and 1990 seasons. The 560 had arrived at the Houseman farm in 1971 from a Paulding County dispersal, where Gerald had bought it for $1,100 after a 3-county search that had taken him 4 weekends across the fall of 1970. The search had been conducted on the principle that Gerald had inherited from his own father's practice: assess the engine first, the hydraulics second, the sheet metal last, and buy from the total mechanical condition rather than from the appearance that a buyer who does not know how to assess the engine responds to. The 560 at the Paulding County dispersal had been in adequate cosmetic condition and exceptional mechanical condition, the 2 facts being independent of each other in the way that the Houseman assessment methodology recognized and that casual buyers failed to account for. Gerald had done the compression test at the dispersal on a cold engine, which was the test that the warm engine check would not have revealed. The cold start compression on a 6-cylinder diesel engine communicated things about the ring sealing and the valve condition at the moment of maximum wear stress that the warm engine check performed after the oil had circulated could not equally demonstrate. All 6 cylinders had been within 4% of each other and within 90% of factory specification, the reading of an engine that had been correctly maintained throughout its 12-year life at the Paulding County farm, and that had not developed the internal wear that the dispersal's typical audience would not have been able to distinguish from adequate condition. He had paid $1,100 and had brought the 560 to the Houseman farm and had started the service log that September, the first entry in the green composition book that he had bought at the Salina Farm Supply for this purpose. The service log format was his father's format, adapted for the 560's specific service requirements, the fuel filter intervals that the diesel demanded at different frequency than the gasoline engines his father had run, the injector service schedule that the 560's power unit required, the governor adjustment that the diesel's power delivery characteristic made more critical than the gasoline carburetor adjustment the previous machines had needed. The service log had entries in Gerald's handwriting from September 1971 through the morning of his death in March of 1989. The final entry in his hand was dated March 12, 1989, the morning he died. The oil drain annotation, written in the moment before the coronary, indicating that the drain was in progress and the filter removal was next. The entry was incomplete. The entry after it, same composition book, next line, different handwriting, was dated March 20th, 1989, 1 week after the funeral, in Dorothy's hand. Oil change completed, filter replaced, valve clearances checked and adjusted, fuel filter service, cold start compression check. All 6 cylinders within 2%, within 91% of factory specification. Machine ready for spring season. The cold start compression check had been Dorothy's addition to the service protocol. Gerald had done the compression test at the Paulding County dispersal but had not included it in the regular service log's annual schedule. He had done it informally, by feel, in the way of a man who knows an engine intimately and who does not need the formal number to know whether the machine is within the range it should be in. Dorothy had added the formal number to the service log entry in March of 1989 because she was taking over primary maintenance of a machine she had observed and participated in the maintenance of for 18 years, but had not personally driven the diagnostic decisions for, and the formal number gave her the baseline against which subsequent entries could be compared. She had been systematic about this. Where Gerald had maintained the service log in the format of a man who understood the machine so thoroughly that the log was primarily a record rather than a diagnostic tool, Dorothy had evolved the log's format slightly, not changing the content, but adding the quantitative checks that allowed her to track the machine's condition over time in the specific way that a baseline and comparison methodology produces. Every annual service entry in her hand included the 6-cylinder compression readings, the hydraulic pressure at full extension, the governor RPM at idle and at rated load, the front axle bearing clearance measurement, the numbers alongside the dates, the trend visible across the years as the entries accumulated. This evolution of the log was not a departure from Gerald's practice. It was a formalization of what Gerald had done informally, the specific translation of tacit knowledge into documented knowledge that the transition from one maintainer to another required. Gerald had known the machine's condition by the accumulated sensory knowledge of 18 years of working alongside it. Dorothy had 18 years of observation, but not 18 years of primary mechanical judgment, and the quantitative baseline gave her the instrument she needed to make the primary mechanical judgment on the same level of accuracy that Gerald's accumulated knowledge had produced. The 560's condition in the spring of 1989, confirmed by the March 20th entry's measurements, was the condition of a machine that had been correctly maintained for 18 years by a man who understood it thoroughly. The compression readings, the hydraulic pressure, the governor specification, all within the ranges that the 560's service manual defined as correct and that Dorothy had obtained from the International Harvester dealer in Salina in the fall of 1988, when she had begun anticipating that the primary maintenance responsibility might shift to her as Gerald's energy in the equipment shed had declined slightly over the previous 2 seasons. She had obtained the service manual, read it, and understood it with the same completeness she brought to every document she engaged with. The manual had been on the workbench beside Gerald's open log on the morning he died. She had found both there when she came with the coffee. She had returned both to the workbench after the ambulance left and had not moved either one until the following Saturday, when she sat down at the workbench with the manual and the log and the service schedule that the log's entries described, and had understood what needed to be completed from Gerald's final entry, and had done it. The 1989 spring planting had been done on schedule. The corn had gone in during the first week of May on the ground that the river bottom's drainage allowed. The 38 tidal cloud acres planted alongside the other 74 without distinction, because the cloud was a legal matter and the ground's need was a farming matter, and Dorothy separated the two with the specific clarity of a person who does not confuse the category of a problem with its solution. The legal problem required a legal solution. The farming problem required a farming solution. She provided both. She had hired a neighbor's son for the planting week, not as management help, not as someone to make decisions, but as the second set of hands that a single-person planting operation required for the specific tasks that 2 people do more safely and efficiently than one. She had directed the work. The neighbor's son had provided the physical capacity the work required. Dorothy had made all the decisions. The 1989 soybean yield had been the benchmark against which the 1990 and subsequent seasons would be measured, within 1% of the 5-year average that Gerald's last 5 seasons had produced, a result that communicated to the community that the management had not declined with the manager's death. The 1990 corn yield had been 3% above the 5-year average, which was a function of the specific weather pattern that August 1990 had produced, rather than any management improvement, but which nonetheless arrived in the community's network as confirmation that the Houseman ground was being worked correctly. Irma Steinbrenner had been the community's most direct observer of both seasons, and her private assessment of Dorothy's management, formed across the 2 years from March 1989 to January 1991 when the estate cleared, was the assessment that she had given her son, a woman who farmed 40 years before she had to do it alone, and who, when she had to do it alone, did it correctly. The correctly was the operative word, not remarkably. Not with the drama of improvisation or the visible effort of struggle. Correctly, the way the farm had been farmed when Gerald was there to farm it with her. The community had wanted to see some evidence of the difficulty, not from cruelty, from the specific human interest that communities take in the management of grief, in the question of how people who have lost something essential continue. Dorothy had not provided the evidence the community was watching for because the evidence was not there. The difficulty was real. The grief was real. The management of 112 acres alone at 61 was genuinely demanding. But the difficulty did not show in the farm's performance because the farm's performance was determined by whether the work was done correctly, and the work was done correctly regardless of how difficult the doing was. This was the specific discipline that 40 years of farming had produced in Dorothy Hausman, the ability to do the work correctly when the conditions under which it was done were not favorable. The farm crisis years of the early 1980s had been an earlier version of this discipline, managing the farm account through the commodity price declines and the interest rate environment without adjusting the operating reserve discipline or the equipment maintenance standard below the levels that the plan required. Gerald had been there for the farm crisis, but Dorothy had been in the farm account through every month of it, making the entries, maintaining the columns, applying the discipline that the crisis was testing. The crisis years had been the dress rehearsal for 1989. The dress rehearsal had prepared her for the performance. The wooden box's discovery in June of 1989 had been the product of a practice that Dorothy had maintained since the early years of her marriage, the systematic and complete inventory of anything that came under her management. When she reorganized a space, she reorganized it entirely, going through every element of the space in the order it presented itself and understanding what was there before moving anything. This was not a special habit developed for the occasion of Gerald's death. It was the way she had always organized spaces and documents and information. The farm office had been reorganized in this way at intervals across her management of it since 1965. The farm account had been reviewed in this way at the end of every season since she took it over. The service log had been read in this way at every annual review. Not just the current entries, but the complete log, understanding the history before addressing the present. She had brought the complete and systematic approach to the closet in June of 1989, because the closet was in the farm office and the farm office was part of the operation she was now managing alone, and the complete inventory was what the complete management required. She had not known the wooden box was on the top shelf. She had known there was a box Gerald had mentioned once, in the early 1950s, without detail. She had reached the top shelf in the course of the complete inventory, and had found it and had gone through it completely, in order, until she understood what was there. The senior houseman's ledger had been in the box's lower section, under a collection of personal letters and 2 photographs, and a small envelope of seeds that the senior houseman had saved from a particularly productive kitchen garden season, and had labeled in pencil, and had preserved with the specific hopefulness of a farmer who saves seeds from good years against the future that might need them. Dorothy had set the seed envelope aside with careful attention, recognizing the handwriting and the specific practice of a man who saved what the land had given and who expected the saving to matter eventually. She had found the ledger beneath the seeds, and had opened it, and had read it from the first entry to the last, the complete ledger in the systematic way she read everything, before she had turned to the land contract section, and had understood what the March 14, 1936 entry meant for the estate's title situation. She had read the final entry 3 times. Contract completed. Deed to be filed. Mercer County Recorder. She had sat with the ledger in her hands in the farm office chair for several minutes, understanding what the entry meant and what the absence of the filing meant, and what the ledger's presence in the box on the top shelf of the closet for 53 years meant for the title cloud that the attorney had described to her in May. Then she had called the attorney. The seed envelope from the senior houseman's kitchen garden was still in the wooden box on the closet shelf in 2009 when Dorothy died. The pencil labeling still legible after 70-some years. The seeds inside probably not viable but preserved with the same hopefulness the senior houseman had put them there with. Dorothy had not planted the seeds. She had preserved the preservation. This was the specific quality of her stewardship, not just the management of the productive assets, the ground and the equipment and the farm account, but the preservation of the things that the productive assets had been built around. The senior houseman's ledger, the seed envelope, the wooden box itself, the complete record of how the farm had come to be what it was before Gerald inherited it, and before she arrived to help him manage it. Carol had understood this about her mother in the specific way that children understand the parents they farm alongside. which is more completely than the people outside the operation can. She had said to her own daughter, 30 years after Dorothy found the wooden box, "Your grandmother reorganized the office in June of 1989 and found a ledger on a closet shelf that had been there since 1947 and called the attorney with it the same afternoon. She did not think about whether to call the attorney. She found the evidence, understood what it was, and acted on it immediately. That is how she did everything. Completely, in order, without hesitation, without waiting for someone else to tell her what to do with what she found." Her daughter had said, "And the farm came from that." Carol had said, "The farm came from 40 years of doing everything that way. The ledger was what the office closet produced when you went through it that way. The farm account was what the columns produced when you maintained them that way. The service log was what the maintenance intervals produced when you kept them that way. Everything she kept produced something." Her daughter had said, "The title nobody knew existed." Carol had said, "The title had been there since 1936. Your grandmother found it in 1989 because she cleaned the office completely. The completeness was the method. The method produced the title. The title cleared the 38 acres. The 38 acres are the heart of the corn rotation. The corn rotation is the center of the farm. Your grandmother cleaned the office. That is where the farm came from in the year she was alone. The farm was 153 acres in 2009 when Dorothy died. It was 153 acres in the years after, under Carol's management and then under the third generation's management. The wooden box was on the closet shelf. The seed envelope was in the box. The senior houseman's ledger was in the box. The March 14, 1936 entry was in the ledger, deed to be filed 1991. That was the whole account. That was what 40 years of farming and one afternoon in a closet and one old Farmall and a ledger from 1936 had built. That was sufficient. The farm continued. The account continued. The handwriting in the account was 3 generations now, but the method was the same, complete, in order, without hesitation. That was everything. The Mercer County farming community's understanding of the Houseman Farm situation evolved across the decade of the 1990s in the way that community understanding of a farming family's situation always evolves, through the accumulation of seasons observed and transactions noted, and conversations at the elevator in the Farm Bureau, and the Salina equipment dealer that provided the data points from which community assessment was constructed. By 1995, the community's understanding of Dorothy Houseman had settled into the specific form of respect that a farming community extends to someone who has demonstrated over multiple seasons and under difficult conditions that the demonstration was not an exception to the general standard, but the general standard expressed under difficult conditions. The distinction was important to the community because it was the distinction between a performance, a temporary achievement produced by unusual effort in unusual circumstances, and a character, which was the permanent expression of a consistent approach to everything the person did. The farming community was experienced at distinguishing between the two, because farming produced both, and the distinction between them became visible across multiple seasons in the way that a single season could not fully reveal. A performance could sustain one difficult season. A character sustained every season, the difficult ones and the ordinary ones and the good ones, with the same standard applied to each. Dorothy had sustained the difficult 1989 and 1990 seasons with the same standard she had applied to every season since 1951. The community had seen this and had completed its assessment by the time the 1991 estate clearing and the Brenner acquisition arrived to confirm what the assessment had concluded. A man named Dewald, who had farmed 160 acres in the next township, and who had been farming alongside the Houseman operation at a distance for 20 years, had stopped at the Houseman farm in the fall of 1991, after the Brenner ground had been incorporated into the operation and the first season of the expanded farm had been harvested. He had asked to see the farm account, not the specific numbers on, not the columns in their detail, but the format, the organization, the structure of the document that the community had heard, through Irma Steinbrenner's account, had been maintained in Dorothy's handwriting since 1965, through the farm crisis and through Gerald's death, and through the 2 years of title complication. Dorothy had shown him the account. She had opened it to the 1989 section and had walked him through the format, the income column, the operating expense column, the equipment fund accumulation, the land fund accumulation. She had shown him the entry where Gerald's regular handwriting ended and her continuation of the same format began. The format was identical across the transition. The columns were the same columns. The numbers had changed, as the seasons had changed them. The structure had not changed. Dewald had said, the account did not change when Gerald died. Dorothy had said, the farm did not change. The account reflects the farm. If the account had changed, something about the farm would have changed. I did not change the farm. He had said, most people would have made adjustments. She had said, adjustments to what? The ground is the same ground. The rotation is the same rotation. The machine is the same machine. Gerald's approach to this farm was correct. Correct approaches do not need adjustment when the person applying them changes. They need to be continued. Dewald had gone home and had told his wife about the account and the conversation. His wife had said, she continued Gerald's approach. His wife had said, did she say anything about what it was like to do that alone? Dewald had said, she said the approach was correct and correct approaches need to be continued. His wife had said, that was her answer to what it was like. He had said yes. His wife had said, that is a specific kind of person. He had said, yes. The specific kind of person that Dorothy was had been formed not just by the 40 years of farming, but by the 20 years before the farming, in the Dark County household she had come from, where the discipline of systematic and complete attention to everything that came under the family's management had been the household standard since before she could articulate what a standard was. Her mother had maintained the household accounts in a format not unlike the farm accounts format. 2 columns, running balance, accumulation toward specific goals stated at the beginning of each year and resolved at the year's end. Dorothy had grown up watching this format applied to the household's resources with the same discipline that she had later applied to the farm accounts resources. The discipline had transferred because the underlying principle was the same. You account for what you have. You accumulate toward what you intend. You maintain the standard regardless of the year's difficulty, and you complete the inventory of whatever you manage so that the inventory produces the information the management requires. The household account her mother kept had produced the information that the Dark County household's management required. The farm account Dorothy kept had produced the information that the Mercer County farm's management required. The wooden box's inventory had produced the ledger that the estate's title situation required. The principle was not farm-specific. The principle was the principle. The farm was the application. Her mother had died in 1981 at 83, having kept the household account in Dark County until the year before her death. Dorothy had been the one to close the account books after her mother died, to make the final entries, to reconcile the final balance, to note in the account's last pages what the account had been working toward and what it had achieved. It was the same practice she would apply 8 years later to the farm account she continued after Gerald died. The account is the person's method made visible, and the method continues after the person if someone who understands the method continues it. Dorothy had understood her mother's method completely. She had carried it to Mercer County in 1951 and had applied it to the farm account that Gerald had started and that she had taken over in 1965, and that she had maintained without interruption until her own death in 2009. Her daughter Carol had understood Dorothy's method completely. She had carried it into the management that followed. The method was not a secret. It was not a proprietary system. It was available to anyone who chose to apply it. The complete inventory, the systematic approach, the standard maintained regardless of conditions, the account as the management's mirror. The reason it was not universal was not that it was unavailable, but that it was demanding, in the specific way that consistent application of a standard across decades is demanding regardless of what the standard is and what the conditions are. The demanding thing was not the standard itself. The demanding thing was the consistency, the refusal to let the conditions of any particular season become the reason the standard was not applied in that season. Dorothy had applied the standard in the spring planting season of 1989 while she was also grieving Gerald's death. She had applied it in the fall harvest of 1990 while the estate settlement was still pending. She had applied it in the spring cultivating of 1991, while she was also completing the Brenner acquisition and adjusting the rotation plan to incorporate the new 24 acres. The conditions of each of those seasons had been different. The standard had been the same. That consistency was what the community had been assessing, and what the community had concluded, by 1995, was the permanent character rather than the temporary performance. The conclusion had not required a formal announcement or a community meeting. It had been formed in the way community conclusions are formed, through enough people arriving independently at the same assessment that the assessment became the accepted reading. The accepted reading of Dorothy Hausman in Mercer County by the mid-1990s was, a woman who farmed 40 years at the standard the farm required, continued at the same standard when she was alone, found the title that completed the farm's legal foundation, and added to the farm twice more after 63 years old. The accepted reading did not include the dramatic language that the situation might seem to invite: the struggle, the loss, the triumph against odds. The accepted reading described what had actually happened, which was a woman who maintained her standard across every season the farm required, including the ones that tested whether the maintenance was a standard or a performance. It had been a standard. The title had been in the closet. The Farmall had been ready. The account had been in her handwriting. The handwriting was the farm. 3 generations of handwriting now, all in the same format, all in the same account, all maintaining the same standard. That was the complete record. That was sufficient.